All right, Ma, here we go. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Source Booksellers. Once again, Friday evening is date night with authors who have written marvelous books. And tonight we're so very pleased to have with us Tamara Payne, who is an author and the collaborator with her father, Les Payne, on the new book called The Dead Are Arising. And it's a new biography of Malcolm X. So we are really thrilled to have them here with us. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening and for registering. As you know, we have books in the store that we'll be happy to sell to you after the event. I think we're also live streaming on YouTube so that people can get it that way as well. And we're also I want to say that we have had the pleasure of finding and utilizing the skills and talents of some local people to be in conversation with our authors. And tonight we're especially happy to have Ms. Rochelle Riley, who is our cultural director of art, culture and arts for Detroit, City of Detroit. So she's our person who's going to be in conversation with Tamara Payne. Before we start, I would like very much for us to acknowledge the work, the leadership, the life of Tamara's father, Les Payne. Les Payne has passed away, but he lived between 1941 and 2018. He was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and was a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist. You know, so often we don't really understand and know the kind of work that journalists do, and because it's not up front and on TV and being shown on the YouTube all the time. But he was an investigative journalist, a foreign correspondent, and an editor at Newsday. He was the founder, which is really a wonderful part of his journey, of the National Association of Black Journalists. And I just want to say that that is quite a high accomplishment, because at one time we were not journalists. We had now and then journalists that we knew about, but the Black newspapers really held the fort for a long time. And so he was the founder and originator of the American Association of Black Journalists. He wrote an award-winning column, and his daughter, Tamara Payne, served as his principal researcher and assistant for, I think it was 10 years. She's going to have to make sure I'm correct about that. She lives now in New York City. So we're ready now to have you see our two wonderful writers and journalists. Rochelle Riley, as some of you who are local would know, was a journalist for our local paper, the Detroit Free Press, for many years before she became the cultural and arts director for the city of Detroit. So welcome, Rochelle Riley.
Thank you very much, Janet.
And welcome, Tamara Payne. There you are.
Thank you. Hi, Rochelle. Hi, Rochelle. How are you?
Hi, how are you, my darling? It's so good to see you. If we're ready, then thank you again, Janet.
Hold the book up for our audience to know that this is the book. It's a nice, fat, thick book. I'm not sure how many pages tomorrow, but you'll tell us. And we're going to ask Rochelle, who is also not only a journalist and cultural arts director, but she's also an author of a beautiful book called The Burden, in which she pulled together a number of writers, established writers, to talk about their life experience as African-American people and the impact of white supremacy and racism and discrimination on their lives and the lives of their people. So her book, The Burden, is also available for sale too. And we're really pleased to have these books in our store. So for those of you who don't know, Source Booksellers is primarily a nonfiction bookstore. We still hold on to our DNA, even though the pandemic has allowed us to stretch way beyond just our nonfiction. So we've carried Rochelle's book, and now we have Tamara's and Les Payne's book in the store. So ladies, it's all yours. Thank you.
So much. Welcome to our conversation on behalf of Source Booksellers. I am thrilled to be here with my friend Tamara Payne to talk about The Dead Are Arising. And this is the book. I am going to hold it up because I need for people to see all the little bookmarks that I've done. And these aren't marking passages that I'm going to ask Tamara to read. These are moments of brilliance, things I didn't know, and some of the amazing writing that is just the hallmark of Les Payne and of course of you, Tamara. So first I want to begin with the person who isn't here, Les Payne, an iconic and revered journalist who for me and for thousands of other journalists was the dean of our industry, the heroic and uncompromising warrior that we all wanted to be. And Tamara, I know that Janet gave people a little bit of information about him, but there's a short bio in the back about your father. And I'd like, if you would, to read that, because I want people to get the full depth and breadth of some of the things that he accomplished and why we respected him so much. So if you could do that before we dive into the book, I would appreciate it.
Okay. Just reading directly from the back pages. Les Payne, born 1941, died 2018, was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, an editor at Newsday and syndicated columnist. He was a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists and served as the organization's 4th president, where he worked to improve racial fairness and media employment practices, and to expand coverage of Black and developing world communities. As an investigative reporter, he won a Pulitzer Prize along with 2 fellow reporters for the Heroin Trail series, which traced the flow of illegal drugs from the poppy fields of Turkey through the French Connection and to the drug addicts in the New York City area. In 1976, he co-wrote The Life and Death of the SLA, about the group of kidnapped newspaper heiress, Patty Hearst, and terrorized the West Coast. He also investigated the Long Island migrant farm worker system, involuntary sterilization of indigent women, atomic testing in Nevada, the FBI surveillance of the Black Panther Party, and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In addition, Payne covered the 1976 Soweto uprising, as well as the Rhodesia-Zimbabwe guerrilla war that brought the late Robert Mugabe to power. As an editor at Newsday, his news staffs won every major award in journalism, including 6 Pulitzer Prize prizes. Payne was an inaugural professor of the David Leventhal Chair at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. In 2017, he was inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame. Payne was a weekly panelist for Sunday Edition on WCBS TV and appeared frequently on Bill Moyer's journal, Nightline, Meet the Press, Good Morning America, Democracy Now!, and Gil Noble's Like It Is.
Wow. That was our Les Payne, and that was the career for probably 10 other people, 10 separate people, and he managed to do all of that in his career. So I just wanted to make sure people got a true sense of all that he accomplished. So thank you for that. Now, before we dive into the book that Les spent almost 3 decades, let me say that again, 3 decades on. Let's learn more about you, Tamara, and how that 3 decades as his principal researcher, not all of it, but as his daughter, you were there while he was working on it, as principal researcher and now co-author, changed your life. So talk to us a little bit first about your first experience with the book, when you knew about it, what he was doing, what it was like, and then what the past 2 years have been like finishing it for your father.
The book changed me definitely. When I first heard that Dad was thinking about this, it wasn't even really thinking about it. He had interviewed the 2 brothers, Wilfred and Philbert Little. He had met through a childhood friend of his who was a surgeon in Detroit, Walter Evans. He was treating one of the brothers. And Dad was an admirer of Malcolm X, and this was a great opportunity to meet one of Malcolm's brothers. So he talked with him for like 7 or 8 hours, recorded that interview, and he learned a lot about their childhood and their relationship, and a little bit more even about the family life. And it was, he couldn't let it go, and as a journalist, as you know, Rochelle, when you have a good story of new information, your spidey senses go off and you can't let that go. So he came back to New York, and he spoke with Gil Noble, who was host of Like It Is, and which is an important, community affairs show that was here in New York, in the tri-state area. And they talked about that. And Gil Noble, also a fan of Malcolm X, they said that, okay, you spoke to Filbert, but Wilford's the brother you should meet. That's the one you should really talk to. So Dad went back and he met Wilford, and he sat for another 8 hours with him, recorded that interview. And he was amazed to learn even more details about Malcolm that was just not known. Dad, as I said just now, that he admired Malcolm X. He had read the autobiography, read his speeches. Growing up, we would listen to his speeches every weekend. I mean, it wasn't just once or twice a year, it wasn't just for his birthday, it wasn't, it was, we would listen to it literally weekly, different, all of his different speeches, Ballad of the Bullet, you name it. And, so Dad really, and what it was Malcolm's analysis of the Black condition during the 1960s, how he had explained it and what he was focusing on, which a lot of people, we should all understand now, is that he really was focusing on dealing with the internalized racism that we have as Black people in this country, from just being our presence here, being whether we are descendants of slaves, but also being denied access to jobs, buying property, finances, starting our businesses, and internalizing the rejection of that. And so Malcolm, and through the Nation of Islam, he was working on that aspect of our condition here in the United States, whereas the other groups, Martin Luther King, were working on dealing with the reversing Jim Crow laws and working on our voters' rights. And so Dad, in learning more about the family, what he realized is that Malcolm has always been given to us fully formed. He's given to us in a vacuum. He's fully formed, angry, and just he's just firing up everybody to stand up for ourselves. So, but we don't hear about where his family is. We don't hear that he has a lineage, that he has grandparents and parents and siblings. I mean, we don't hear that every day. And certainly now that Malcolm's been dead for so long, we really haven't heard about that. We read a little bit about it here and there, but to really fully understand, Malcolm did not become Malcolm by himself. When we talk about, when he was in prison, he read everything and that's no. He had a family that helped him. And we are also the sum total of our families. And that's what Dad was filling in that picture of Malcolm, who he is as a person. And so when I was in from 1989 to 91, I was a teacher in China. I taught English. And when I came back during one of my visits, Dad had just finished doing these interviews and he couldn't stop talking about it. And he had decided, and I was in on the conversation when he decided that he wanted to write a biography of Malcolm X. And I said, great. And Malcolm's name was already in the air. People were talking about it. Rappers were using his speeches in their songs. They were quoting him in their interviews. I mean, he was in the air. Spike Lee was starting to talk about doing his movie about Malcolm, which later came out. But he was in the air already. People were listening to his speeches on 125th Street and probably every Black community throughout the country. And what we learned throughout the world, and not just Black communities. So what I learned really was Malcolm didn't just stay here. And also Malcolm didn't just die in 1965. He never left the scene. we were gifted with that autobiography, and people read it. I read it, my brothers read it, and everybody who says that they read it, it changed them. It helped them deal with the situation where, at whatever phase they were in. If they read this book, it gave them some answers to navigating, these oppressive situations that we find ourselves in everyday life. And that's how it changes us. But then it's like, but who is this man that is giving us this information? And that's what we bring it back to. So when I came back from my teaching stint in China, I started working on the book with Dad. And that was in 1991, actually, the summer of. But he had started the interviews in 1990, and I'd been on him till what we have right now. So that's been a sum total of 30 years for me. What I learned so much. I learned a lot about interviewing, journalism, how do you prepare to speak to people, learning how, even in writing, and how you bring your audience into, there's so many things. How do you bring the audience into your story, and how do you communicate as a writer with your audience through the written page? And my father and I would have these kinds of discussions all the time, because as his daughter and confidant on this project, he told me a lot of things, pretty much, everything, because I was his confidant. And I did not share this information with people. Nobody heard anything from me about what was in this book. We had other researchers on here, and I also want to take this opportunity to thank Faith Childs, my father's literary agent, who was on the receiving end of the conversation about when he wanted to write this book. She was very instrumental and receptive to this idea. And she has worked tirelessly these 30 years in supporting this project. Conversations with Dad, encouraging him, and she never, even when he passed away, she was always supportive, and she was a rock for me in a lot of ways. I also want to give special thanks to Liz Bass, who was an editor at Newsday, who worked with my dad. She was his science and health editor, and then after she didn't work with him anymore, she went on to become their deputy national editor and deputy foreign editor. But she has a mind of an editor, and her brain with language is amazing. And we've had many great conversations also about writing, but she also edited my father. And she was very helpful, for me and just keeping his voice together. Because what was so important for me in making sure this book is published is that my father's voice remained intact. And so she was very helpful with that. I also want to thank the Live Right team, Bob Weil and Nick Curley, who's helping out with the sales and tracking the sales for us, as well as Peter Miller with publicity and arranging such events as this with Source Books.
We all want
Live Right, very supportive. I'm sorry.
All of those people too, this team that helped bring this together. I think that all of you have pulled together to give us a great gift. And you mentioned that your father filled in the parts of Malcolm that were not just about him being fully formed. I want to read something to you and then get you to comment about it, because this is about your father becoming fully formed. He took Malcolm from being a symbol to being a whole person, boy, teenager, young hustler, man, someone discovering this new way of life, leader, all of that. In your introduction, which made me cry, you wrote this. Malcolm also changed the way Les Payne viewed himself. As a college student in 1963, he had heard Malcolm speak in Hartford, Connecticut. On that June night, my father came face to face with his own self-loathing. Malcolm X addressed the race issue head on. Now, I know you don't want to be called Black, he said. You want to be called Negro. But what does Negro mean except Black in Spanish? So what are you saying? It's okay to call me Black in Spanish, but don't call me Black in English? Later in the night, I Stopped Being a Negro, an essay that was first published in a collection titled When Race Becomes Real. Payne wrote that he had entered Bushnell Hall as a Negro with a capital N, and wandered out into the parking lot as a Black man. That's the Les Payne that I knew. The Les Payne that I knew was the one who had gone through all of those incarnations from Tuscaloosa to New York and Newsday to become this iconic journalist. But to see that moment when he became the person that we knew and idolized and wanted to be was really powerful for me. So in talking about working with this man, which everybody wanted to do, I almost wanted to go to Newsday just to work with Les Payne. I did not do it. Describe how you two worked together, where you worked in the house. I mean, he worked for years in the streets, you know, in the poppy fields, everywhere. But when you were actually working together, where did you work and what was that like? Was there a room? Was it the whole house? Did you go to a special place?
In the house, we were really around the computer a lot. And in the kitchen table where we would talk about things, we'd bring out our files and just start talking about different interviews. But Dad would do a lot of these interviews and I would transcribe them. So I would transcribe the interviews, and that's how I became very versed in the process and who these people were and what they had to say. I knew their voices, I understood their stories. And in doing that, I also was able to, speak with my dad about questions I had, you know, outside of what he was asking, things that might, you know, and I wasn't even thinking about like, because I always look at it, this is my dad and he knows what he's doing, who am I? But Dad really enjoyed input from other people and what we were thinking. And so we had great discussions about that, just about process even. So looking through files, things that were interesting to him, we would talk about what was important to the story, things that he wanted to go back and ask, things he needed confirmation on. Like if somebody spoke about a lynching, for example, I might want to go look up and find out if there was any news reports about the lynching, you know, and other details. If there were other people involved, maybe I could help find those people who were also either witnesses or were also affected by that and how that affected them. Because again, these lynchings that happen in throughout the country, right? They impacted people in which they said, I can't live in this community that does this, or my family is not safe. In order for me to feel safer with my family, I have to get them out of here. So a lot of times they would go north because of that. And then just learning these stories and just collecting these stories and then listening to their children even. Sometimes I might talk to the children who were not necessarily part of the immediate story, but to find out what they thought of that situation, especially if they were, you know, during, if they were like children in the household who were being moved up north to any of these different cities, which included Detroit and Chicago, Hartford, New York, any number of these cities, right? DC and Baltimore even, but, you know, but we were definitely in the house, but just having these conversations about how this information, because it was history that we've heard all the time, but now there's a direction where these stories are going, right? To impact on how Malcolm took, when he heard these stories, or understood these stories, how he was able to put it through his filters and find a way of appealing to people to join the nation or anything that he might be working on and help them overcome and become more independent. Because again, what we haven't mentioned is that the Marcus Garvey movement was very important to him and his family. So, you know, this whole thing of self-determination, building your own businesses, building your community, supporting your community, how you treat each other. These were very important. And then also changing the images of how you see each other. And these are conversations that Malcolm had to constantly have you know, with people who were traumatized. We were traumatized. And even if we weren't part of the actual scenes of those lynchings or the running or the process of the running, we're still traumatized by the stories our ancestors have told us over the years. So that's kind of just bring that into it.
This is good. That was one of the things I wanted to get to next, because Malcolm, and many people don't really talk about this or pay enough attention to it, was really moved, even though he was little, by the way his father lived. So his father's life as someone who, you know, fought the system and was his own man and would get in trouble because, you know, Malcolm did that same thing. So we go from Marcus Garvey to the Nation of Islam, and it's almost like these parallel lives in different decades where these two men tried to change life for, you know, African Americans or then for Black people. I tell you, these words from Gambino Iglesias, he's this author and book reviewer and professor in Austin. He said, definitive is a word we must use carefully when talking about biographies because it implies a degree of finality that research and new information may prove wrong. That said, Les and Tamara Payne's The Dead Are Arising is now the definitive biography of Malcolm X. And I wanted to ask, did all of those things have to be in there for this to be the definitive book? His childhood, everything that was going on with his parents while his mom was pregnant with him, that scene, talk a little bit about that scene with the Klan. And I told you about this where your dad and some of his friends, we were all sitting around a table encouraging him. This was several years ago, saying, when are you going to finish the Malcolm book? When are you going to finish the Malcolm book? And he literally pulled out something and read from it. And I taped it. I'm going to find that tape. I was going to surprise you and play it tonight. I can't find it. I think I sent it to your brother Jamal, but I will find it so you will have it to use. But can you talk a little bit about that scene and how he literally made sure he went to a dozen different sources to make sure he got every detail right of Malcolm's mother standing there pregnant, facing down these cowards, you know, with their rifles and their white sheets?
I mean, that really was coming from the brothers and the siblings, really, who were alive at the time. So that would, Filbert was a baby. His Malcolm's sister Hilda was a toddler. She was 3 years old, and Wilfred was about 6. You know, and it's terrifying. You know, that the opening scene, and Malcolm's in utero. You know, she is pregnant with Malcolm. And what was happening, as we know already, that the parents, Earl and his mother, Louise, they met in Montreal at a Marcus Garvey meeting, Universal Negro Improvement Association meeting. And they met there at one of these meetings, and they were inspired and they were attracted to this group. And so when they met each other, they fell in love and they wanted to continue the work of this group together. And they moved across the country, and what they would do is organize families in not highly populated towns that were highly populated by Black people, but to encourage people to move there for opportunities, creating their opportunities and building up their communities. And that's what they would do. And they're very aspirational in that sense. And and it was tough. It was really hard to do that. In Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925, is one of these towns. Now, the other thing about this story is that in 1919, Omaha, Nebraska was the scene of the Will Brown lynching, which was known as the Omaha incident, which was this horrible lynching that took place there. And when the family moved in, they were still feeling remnants of that. The other Black families in the community were still terrorized by that, as well as white people. I mean, it still affected them. But anyway, fast forward to the opening of the book, Earl Little's not on the scene. He's actually organizing other families in a few towns away. Louise is there with her children, and the Klan visits. And they don't like the activities of the Little family. And they feel that they're causing, too much trouble among the Black good Negroes of Omaha, and they're terrorizing the Little family to scare them out, and they want them out of there. And Louise Little that evening, she stands up to them with her kids. I mean, Filbert's crying in the back room as described in the book, and she's got her toddlers there, and Wilfred's there, and he talks about the horses particularly. I mean, these details that he remembered from that scene, just being impressed that there are these horses. But it was also a terrifying encounter. He sees his mother is terribly upset. He becomes upset, and he's not fully understanding why. But it's a terrifying scene for this family. So, and that when we talk about Malcolm, what we want to talk about is not just who Malcolm is, but the world he was born into. And this is the world he's born into.
Which is really sad. And every single instance of these things that happens, the lynching description that your dad was able to pull together with the research, I literally, it made my skin crawl. And then there were also moments like when he realized he was ready to accept Islam and what he wrote. And then there was another moment where, I mean, there were all of these like special moments. So what I want to do, but first I want to tell our viewers, because the people who get this book, and you must get this book, I want readers to know that this book is 523 pages of brilliant reporting and writing, and 89 pages of indices, notes, and bibliography. Over all of this time, as you were, you know, this was like your life. This was more than, you know, half your life. Did your dad ever walk in from one of these 7-hour interviews and say, okay, I need you to transcribe this, and you go, oh my God, it's just stunning. But this was who Les Payne always was, and how he always worked. So I need people to know that, because 523 pages of this amazing, amazing writing and reporting, and 89 pages of indices and notes and bibliography. I want to go back now to the question I've been dying to ask you since you asked me to do this. What was the thing that surprised you the most? The revelation that, you know, Malcolm, you read the autobiography, your dad talked about him. What thing out of all of this did you go, oh, wow?
It changes, you know, because I've been working on this for now 30 years. And in the last 2 years, in particularly very, like, just steadily full-time. Now, I would have to say the 28 years before, my father would say, I was like, Dad, I spent more than half my life on this. And he says, yes, but not full-time. And it's true. I had jobs. He had his jobs. But
sounds like
this was an incredible undertaking. And I was committed to it. I mean, I understood how great that this project was going to be, because one thing about my father is that also knowing, you know, what he lived through. Like, he was born in Jim Crow South. His family moved up to Hartford, Connecticut. So these are things that he's experiencing firsthand. And he also served in the Army, as we've talked about in his biography. But I wanted to say that because my father lived through those experiences, and having the mind that he has, and being able to analyze this, and his interest in getting this information, and also understanding when he was a journalist, and we're like well into his career as a journalist, you know, the power of journalism, which is the power of information is powerful, the power to inform the people through a free press, protected by the US Constitution, so that people can make informed decisions. And, you know, and that was how he operated. So it's like all of this stuff, and this is to me what makes this book important, because we're not talking about somebody who did not live through some of these experiences. He lived through them firsthand. So he has a lot to draw on, and his family. So that's also what's key to this. For me, I would say what changed to me, I think at the end of the day, was just how incredibly complex these times were. From even in 1925 on. And also in working on this, I also got to understand my dad's, you know, patience and tolerance in dealing with people who didn't necessarily understand what was going on, but also in doing the interviews and having tough interviews. And you know, it's so many things, you know, I learned and that impressed me. But the thing that really impressed me overall is, one, Malcolm never wavered from his passion to want Black people to free themselves from the restraints of racism, mentally, especially. He never wavered from that. And if you think, I mean, and there are things that that were in conflict. There were things in which he distanced himself from. Yes, there are egos. Yes, he drifted when he was a teenager into selling drugs and stuff like that. But it's like, these are all things that many people out there who are going to pick up this book today and read this also experience, you know, and if you realize who this person is and that he had flaws like we have flaws, but also his passion and his focus and his tenacity to stay on that point. That's, I think, what moved me. And even in watching my father, you know, and handling all this information, because he kept thinking like, you know, it wasn't that he wanted to tell a story a certain way. He wanted to know what the story was and to tell it as well as he could, because what's important is that he wanted it verified. He didn't want to come up with some idea that, yes, there were rumors that people said, but if we could not verify it, we couldn't put it in the book. He's like, if I can't verify, I don't feel comfortable putting it in there. I can't defend it. I can't, you know, but everything that we have in there, he definitely would stand by, and I do too.
That was one of those things that was a hallmark of your dad. It's almost like parallel lives again, where, you know, Malcolm was steadfast in his belief and his mission and what he wanted to do. Les was that same way with Black journalists, in making sure that we always knew we were as good as, and in many cases better than, making sure that he fought for Black journalists to have the rights to do that. And I love what you said about him not wanting to put anything in that wasn't. Les didn't send people out to get a story. He sent people out to find the story. Don't go looking to see if you can't fill in some bones of something you assume. Go find out what the story is. And if the story is not what it should be, or you don't have the whole thing, then don't come back. And I think that he literally changed the lives of so many people doing that, not just making us feel comfortable being unapologetically Black, but just making us feel comfortable being good journalists, and living up to his example, the example set by so many of his peers and his mentees, you know, people like Derek Jackson and Dwayne Wickham, who were his dear friends, who helped co-found the Trotter Group, the Monroe Trotter Group for Black columnists, where we write unapologetically Black, but also being one of those founders of the National Association of Black Journalists, because he was determined that there would not be wrongs that we couldn't try to right. So it's just so powerful that this would be the man to tell the story of this man, and that you helped him for all of that long. I want to remind people to put their questions in the chat. We'll have Source Booksellers open that up, because we're going to move to the Q&A in a minute, and you can ask Tamara the things that you like. But I want to ask you this, and it's always that dumb question, because, you know, what are you proud of? The book. But out of this whole process, is there some moment or some one thing that you are proudest of over this 3-decade journey?
Getting it out there and having his voice intact. But I also want to say that I would never be able to do this without the help of my own family, my mom, and my brothers. I mean, when my father passed away in 2018, I was devastated. We all were. And, but, you know, what was always on my mind was that even though he's not here, his book will be finished. And I was very focused on that. And I just, you know, and my family, you know, they really helped and supported me. And their support also allowed me to focus on these last 2 years full time on this. And it required that. And I'm most proud of the support that I received from my family on that too. So it's important that we also acknowledge our families, that, you know, and we have, you know, as I say to people, we don't get here by ourselves, you know, and we can say that, we can try and say that we do, but we really don't.
And he was always so meticulous about thanking your mom, thanking his wife. Even I remember we went on a cruise, and it was supposed to be just a cruise, just hanging out, but we found a slave museum, a museum of the enslaved. I think this might have been in the Bahamas, or when we went on that cruise that time, but we wound up spending a whole afternoon in that museum looking at things and talking about things and understanding history. And that was as important a part of that trip to me as, you know, going out to a club or having dinner. He was always so cerebral and so on point all the time. So I'm not surprised by the breadth and the genius of the book. I just want to make sure that I thank you for making sure that his voice was intact and that you got it done.
Thank you. I wanted to read a little bit from the book, if I can.
I was going to say, while we're waiting for questions, I wanted you to, but if you have a passage you prefer, you do that, because I had one I wanted you to read. But what do you
I'd like to read one about Louise, and then there was another one I wanted to read about Wilfred too.
Okay.
And I think the Wilfred one might be a little shorter, but I'll start with the Louise one. And this is really about how Louise conditioned the children in being Black when they were younger. And this is also before their father had passed away. This is when they were young.
Okay.
The story of Little Black Samba, published in 1899 by the British writer Helen Bannerman, was a standard children's reader at Pleasant Grove, which was the school that they attended in Lansing. The illustrations of the dark Indian child caused derisive snickering among whites, but the pickaninny slur, along with the unrestrained bandying about of the term nigger, repulsed the little children who were taught at home to disparage such put-downs of the Black race. As the taunts escalated, it was their mother, Louise, who conditioned Malcolm and his siblings not to overreact to the racial slurs. "We didn't like being called nigger," Wilfred said, "but we would try to downplay it. My mother always told us that you can handle racial slurs in a way where you make them continue, or you can let them think they're not hurting you. She would give an example. If you're throwing darts at a dartboard, there's a satisfaction you get when you hit the target. When you miss it, you get another feeling. Well, she said, it's the same with white people when they're throwing darts at you by things they say and do, but if they don't hit the target, then they won't get that satisfaction, and eventually they'll quit. And usually that's the way it worked out. This psychological training for resistance to racial provocation was conditioned into the behavior of young Malcolm and his siblings. Their behavior earned grudging respect among a growing number of whites in their neighborhood, despite, and in some cases, because of their adherence to Garveyism. And I like that passage because it just talks about a lot. I mean, I don't think that this is an anomaly. I think this is a conversation that does happen in a lot of Black families, but that it happened, in the 40s, in the 20s and 30s, in the Little family in Lansing, that conversation was being had. And it's something that we should know that we do have in common. This next passage I just want to read is, it's about when Wilfred discovers the Nation of Islam in Detroit.
That was the one. Detroit.
Yeah. Malcolm's family had stumbled upon this religion because their eldest brother, Wilfred, lived his life by the secular teachings of Marcus Garvey. As a devotee of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, doctrine of self-reliance, Wilfred would occasionally challenge management over unfair treatment of fellow Negroes at the Detroit furniture store where he worked. Several white male supervisors, for example, were confronted directly for harassing female employees by patting their backsides. "Suppose I was pulling this stuff with one of your women." Wilfred remembers asking the sexual predators. That's typical dad. "What would you think?" And they would go and apologize. In other cases, Wilfred noticed that when Negroes came due for their raises or promotions, they, unlike whites, were targeted for intimidation that was staged by management. He concluded to forestall their advancement. After observing yet another such worker, a delivery truck driver, being dressed down by management in the store, Wilfred level-headedly confronted the white manager. "Why don't you leave this man alone?" I said. You know good and well that he deserves his raise. You're trying to intimidate him so he won't ask for it. So they went on and they gave him the raise." Wilfred added, "Everyone thought I was going to get fired, but they didn't fire me. Instead, the store manager took him aside and inquired whether Wilfred, who had made himself valuable with his skill and work ethic, was satisfied with his personal situation. Subsequently, to the surprise of those who he had defended, Wilfred was promoted. Still, the one-man labor union, true to the Garveyite prompting of Negro assertiveness, matters of racial fairness, sustained his gentle but effective pressure even as a supervisor at the household furniture store. Such aggressiveness was indeed rare for Negroes in the American workplace of the 1940s, and Malcolm's older brother did not go unnoticed. "You're a Muslim, aren't you?" asked David Farr, the driver whose pay raise Wilfred had salvaged from the reluctant management. "What is it?" said Wilfred, who had never heard of such a group. "What makes you think I'm a Muslim?" "For one thing," Farr said, "you always straighten out these white folks around here when they're not right. You make them respect our Black women when they come in here. You don't smoke, you don't drink, you're always trying to encourage Black people to do what's best for them and things like that. And you make these white people improve our jobs for us and make them give us our raise when it's due. If Muslims taught and practiced such self-help, curious, Wilfred was interested. He asked the delivery driver, where did they meet? The Detroit chapter of the Garvey's UNIA, which Malcolm's father helped organize back in the 1920s, had dwindled to a small group of elderly pioneers holding on against younger members in outside competition. So Wilfred attended his first meeting of the Nation of Islam with David Farr in an apartment building on St. Anne Drive. Initially, he was turned off by the boastful emptiness of the Muslim speaker that first Sunday, but he returned the following week when a more progressive message was delivered by one minister, Andrew, to the Muslim temple at Muslims at Temple Number 1, where the Nation of Islam had been founded by Fard Muhammad about a dozen years earlier. They didn't have that many people, Wilfred recalled, but he sensed that it had the potential of becoming much more than it had. I decided, well, I'm going to get with this Nation of Islam and see if we can make something out of it.
I love the way you got that. Yeah, let's see if we can make something out of it. We have a question, but before we do that, your brother Jamal is on, and he is as excited as I am to just, you mentioned Detroit. Can you talk just for a second about what Detroit meant to your dad and the fact that a lot of this started with that interview in Detroit?
Detroit was, I gained a love for Detroit through my dad because of our experiences of the work that we did on the book here. But Detroit was important to Dad because, I mean, we had family here also, but people in Detroit are real.
Yes, we are.
He really felt, and they're hardworking and you're real, and there's something really grounded and down to earth about Detroit. And, he had his first convention, National Association of Black Journalists, the one that he manned as president, was in Detroit. And he always had a special place in his heart for Detroit. He loved Detroit people. His best friend of many, from childhood, resided in Detroit for many years, Walter Evans. And we, like I said, we also had family here, but he really enjoyed Detroit because of the history, the groundedness. People were very real. It was very tough, but he really appreciated and respected Detroit. And I always, whenever I meet people from Detroit, I always say, there's always a special place in my heart for them.
Thank you. I want to sneak in a couple of questions before we have to stop. From Calissa, out of the hundreds of people that your dad interviewed and that you interviewed, she wanted to know, did you find that anyone was reluctant to be interviewed? Or did anybody say?
Yeah, quite a few were reluctant. And Dad had a way, I mean, first of all, when we talk about lessons that I learned from my father, you don't accept the first no, just because somebody said no. There's usually a reason why they said no. Sometimes there are different ways that you can come back to that person. It reminds me, like when somebody says something's off the record, how do you work around that? And I remember just saying, like, okay, find somebody else who can verify that, or find another way to come around to that. But it's a negotiation, really. I mean, it's how we talk with people. I mean, this is what journalism is. It's the talking. But I do want to say it wasn't hundreds of people. It was hundreds of hours of interviews. But it was a lot of people. You know, it was a lot of people. So I don't want it out there. It was hundreds of people.
And and thank you for correcting me, because I didn't mean to say hundreds of people, but she was asking who else you interviewed, and there were a lot of people. So hundreds of hours of interviews with a lot of people. Besides the family, was there someone else who was really very important in getting some of the background?
I think talking with Jeremiah Shabazz, who was then known as Jeremiah X, was the minister of Atlanta. Captain Joseph in New York, who was the captain of the Harlem Temple under Malcolm, and he was also from Detroit. Right. Joseph Gravitt, it was his original name. Who else? I mean, there were so many, and in different phases. I mean, this book is monumental in the sense that Dad was going from cradle to grave. It starts with talking with the family and learning about the family, but then it's like you learning about the inner workings of the organization. And inner workings of any organization, as you know, even with National Association of Journalism, Black journalists and Trotter Group, and in many organizations you've been members of, I'm sure, you know, that there are personalities you have to deal with. There's jealousies. There are different people's agendas and why people join and what they're getting out of it. And then you have to make sure why you want to be a part of an organization. That was the other thing I was learning. The importance, like we say, that we don't do any of this alone. The importance of being a part of an organization. You do need a group to make things happen. Organizing is so important. And that was something Dad preached all my life. You know, it's always important. Like if you get to a job, I mean, it's really important that you're organizing quickly to understand what, you know, who else is there and what are other people doing. People who look like us, and what are the agendas, and what is it that you guys can work to do, because there's going to be a time that we're going to be set upon. And so if you have an organization to deal with, it's not as easy to just take off individuals. But if you have an organization already set in place, then management needs to meet with the organization, and they have to give explanations to what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Right. We've got one last question. And before we take that one, I want to congratulate you and your dad on the book being a National Book Award finalist. I'm so excited. Those announcements are going to be coming up. I have them marked on my calendar and I can't wait. So congratulations for that. That is perfect. Perfect. We've got a question from Audrey who wanted to know. She's really looking forward to the book. And she said, what do you think about the truthfulness and verifiability of the autobiography of Malcolm X, since Alex Haley seemed to do some ghostwriting, especially toward the end when Malcolm was deceased and could not review Haley's words?
Well, I mean, I think that the autobiography in itself, I mean, the reason why an autobiography is an autobiography is the person's telling the story that they want to tell of themselves. They're not necessarily telling the full story of what happened. And so either way, it wasn't going to be necessary. Like I said, there were things, he didn't spend a lot of time talking about his relationship with his mother, and especially towards the time when she was committed to an institution, and his role in, you know, and because of, and again, I have to stress, he was a teenager, and teenagers individuate, and a lot of his hustling days were during his teen years. And it's funny to me when I say that now, because a lot of times people actually, when they talk about Malcolm as a hustler, they make him sound like he was 25, you know, going on 30, and he wasn't. And so, I mean, I think it's important that we, and that's the thing, we're putting Malcolm in a context and in a timeline even of growth and individuation and navigation through these different phases. And horrible things happen to the family that they did not control. They didn't control, you know, their neighbors burning them out of their home. And they didn't control that they were going to evict them because they didn't want a black family in the neighborhood, even though, and there was an exclusionary clause. They thought they legally got that land. So how does that impact you? How does, you know, when you see these things happening time and time again, the Klan visiting, you hearing that story, you seeing, you know, how people are being affected by the larger society, your family's being pushed off land that you think we own, you're being farmers, you're developing, you know, you're developing things for your community that you think is going to be helpful. And all their neighbors were not Black, right. You know, they were also immigrants.
After the fire.
So,
family that let them come over and stay, which was just unheard of. So, you know. Oh, you know what? Janet says that we do have another question from YouTube, because this is being shown for Zoom for Source, but also on YouTube. Based on the learning of you and your father throughout this process, from your perspective, what do you believe Brother Malcolm's personal critique reflecting on his life's work in retrospect? That's from Jason Rivers. What do you believe Malcolm's personal critique would be if he was reflecting on his own life in retrospect? That's a deep question, Jason.
It's a deep question. Gonna have to take a pass on that one right now. I mean, that's a good question to think about. I mean, I think, you know, he, at the end of his life, he did talk about some of the mistakes he made. But again, I think we have to look at context and what information he was operating on and where he was in his own development, and where, you know, and I don't know that I think that we have to be allowed to learn and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. So that would be my answer.
I don't need to speak for Malcolm either. I do want to end with just this one little paragraph. This is after Malcolm's father was killed, and the way his father was either accidentally killed according to the police or killed on purpose according to people who later came with money and apologized. But after his death, he talked about Malcolm spending his life searching for this anchor. And they were talking about how hard it was for the family after that happened. Surviving during the Depression placed great stress upon the family's values of pride and self-reliance, to say nothing of career planning. They wanted you to go into entertainment, or, you know, these jobs that were allowed, and just the grief his mother felt. This sentence stopped me cold. My mother stopped singing. Filbert commented about the effect of the death and the depression on the family. Instead of being the happy person when our father was alive, she was quiet. That struck me so much. And that's the kind of stuff that 8 hours of interviews will get you, where you get people to talking and you get to the actual kernel of truth of how they lived or what they felt. That was something that your father did at Newsday in his life and his career as a journalist, but it's something that the two of you accomplished in this book. And I want to thank you for that, because like I said, I found a lot of those moments. So I want everybody to remember, it's called The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. It is an amazing National Book Award finalist. You want to get it, you want to read it, and then you want to talk about it. I want to thank you so much, Tamara, for being on with us here in Detroit. And I want to bring back Janet and Allison and say, I will see you soon. Thank you, my friend.
See you soon.
Thank you to both of you. What a beautiful interview. Rochelle, you are fabulous in posing the questions. And Tamara, you're so generous in your responses and your depth of understanding. I have such an appreciation for your work with this book. We are thrilled to have already sold almost a full case of books from the store.
Oh, wonderful. Yay.
It's not just selling, it's what we call hand selling. We recognize a person coming in the store, which we have very few of now, or someone on the phone, and we hand sell the book. We said, this is a book you must have. And we want you to share it with other people. And people will say, well, there's this book and that book I read. And my response often is, there are probably 1,500 books on Abraham Lincoln. Why not 10 or more on Malcolm? Because he's just as complex and just as pivotal as President Lincoln was. Thank you so much, Rochelle, for your work. I really appreciate it. Our Saturday night dates are great. We are going to Friday night dates are great. Not Saturday, Friday night dates are great. And having authors on to talk about their books and talk about their work, we feel is a contribution to the community, so that we can have a deeper understanding of how complex and complicated this kind of work is. And our tagline on our store window, as well as on our social media things, is making the literary arts visible. That frequently we can see the visual arts quite quickly, but we want to make these literary arts visible. And the book, The Dead Are Arising, is certainly a visible work of art. And we are hoping and rooting and wishing with all of our fingers and toes and eyes and ears that it will win the National Book Award for Nonfiction for 2020. It would be an absolute crown to look into your work. So thank you again,
Thank you,
Allison.
I was just saying the same thing, that we're really rooting for it, not just because we're a nonfiction bookstore, but because we love the book.
Mm-hmm. And it's a must read for everywhere. I have to say that I want to encourage schools and libraries, and particularly universities and colleges, to have the book as part of their curriculum. And if anything I can do to do that, I don't even know how much I can do, but wherever I have an opportunity, I certainly think it should be a must read for many people all over everywhere, because he touched the whole globe. He really did. Yes. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you, audience.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate, your books and everything that you're doing in the community. And I definitely looking forward to coming to visit.
We're going to make it happen some way, somewhere between
Absolutely.
22.
Yes, definitely.
Right. Yes.
Thank you.
For those of you who joined us this evening, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
The book is for sale on our website, our online website, sourcebooksellersonline.com. It's in the store, and we're expecting to have other copies in regularly all through the holidays. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to have the book. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Tamara.